What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another album review, and today, well, I'm talking about probably the second biggest release that came out this weekend, however, third review overall, and this is a band that I've been curious about reviewing for a while, never did until now. I am talking about the latest offering from Deafheaven, Lonely People with Power. This also came out on March 28th, this time on Roadrunner Records. Wow, can you believe it? Roadrunner actually putting out a metal band nowadays? Yeah, kind of hard to find unless you're Gojira or Trivium. That's pretty much it. But anyways, so yeah, Deafheaven, probably one of the most polarizing metal bands out there. They're often considered one of the most popular bands, really the most popular band of the style known as blackgaze or even post-black metal, which I'm not the world's biggest fan of that kind of black metal, but if it's done right, it's enjoyable. So Deafheaven has become one of those bands that's really associated with this style of black metal, but also, like I said, they're very, very polarizing. You either love them or you hate them. There's very little people out there that is like right down the middle. So yeah, I was curious to hear what I was going to get myself into with this album, considering I never listened to a full Deafheaven album from start to finish. I've only heard like bits of songs in the past, and it wasn't bad from what I heard, but it just wasn't my cup of tea. But obviously in the years since, my tastes have shifted, and I can get into more abstract stuff a little bit more, depending on the style and the band, of course. But one thing I will say is that top to bottom, this album is bright. It is so bright and atmospheric. It's almost too much brightness and atmosphere on this album, I would argue. Like, the three-part song, Incidental, you have three parts of this song. Part one, which was the opening track, even though I was like hearing how it started, I'm like, is that the THX theme you remember at some of the movies? I thought I was about to hear a version of that before you get these like weird like static moans and synths. And then Incidental Part 2 pretty much continues that, but you do have some female vocals on top, some clean guitars going on before it just kind of shifts into distorted industrial noise. And then the third part was easily the best of the three parts, even though that's not saying much, but it's like more atmosphere, and also you get spoken word sections. So I get they were maybe trying to tell a story with those three tracks, but aside from that, wasn't for me. But all the other tracks, so we kick off with Doberman, starts off with a melodic riff and groove, and that's a word associated with this album quite a bit, and that's groove, which black metal and groove, I don't necessarily associate the two together all that much unless you have like triplet chugs that groove or doom grooves, but not like natural grooves. There's a lot of like natural groove going on across the board on this entire album. But here with Doberman, after it kind of lumbers along like a lumbering groove, then you get the other big component, and that is, of course, your classic melodic tremolos and blast beats of black metal, but of course with the brightness and the themes and some of the atmospheres of shoegaze music, or really, as I would call it, like dirty alternative rock, if anything. But then comes along a nice like galloping chug on top of a breakdown, which you don't really hear chugs that much, or breakdowns really hardly at all on this album. But then another thing that really comes into play is all the melodies. Like, the melodies on, I would say, Amethyst, Revelator, which I'll talk more about that song later, and then even towards songs like Winona or the closer to Marvelous Orange Tree. Like, those songs, when it comes to melodies, they can write some catchy and thought-provoking melodies for sure musically. Like, hell, even in Doberman, it turns rather lush. And there are a lot of lush melodies that get peppered in on a lot of these songs. Magnolia, kind of an interesting one because it starts off with these like off-time riffs and blast beats, and then it gets into like a double-time rhythm, which is really the only time on this album I would say that, but it's on top of some really cool tremolos. And of course, I would say in terms of like a lot of these atonal sections, feel more closer to post-hardcore than black metal or death metal. Like, these feel closer and more geared towards post-hardcore, which post-hardcore isn't always my bag, and I'll touch more on that later on. The Garden Route is, for the most part, like, very melodic, very groove-oriented, some really cool bass moments that show up here, too. It's very atmospheric, and it's more up-tempo, even a lead melody, even though lead melodies are kind of hard to come by on here. However, the vocals, I feel they kind of take away from everything. Like, this is a song, I think there should have been some clean vocals on top. And clean vocals do show up on tracks like Heathen and, of course, The Marvelous Orange Tree. Those two songs have some solid clean vocal passages. Like Heathen, it's clean guitars and vocals on top of, like, up-tempo drums, but it is very major chord driven. Amethyst has, again, more of those like lush melodies, but you do get a really big chorus, and this is the longest track of the album at over 8 minutes. But of course, they do bring back some of the black metal with the higher end tremolo melodies and the blast beats. Now, Revelator. This was the big standout for me personally because this is where you finally got a little more aggression. Actually, a lot more aggression. Like, there's some heavy chugging riffs going on here that almost border on death metal a little bit. And the chugs heavily in the blast beats. There's even those, like, atonal machine gun riffs that almost feel geared towards blackened death metal bands, kind of like Necrophobic a little bit, I would argue. And of course, you do get your black metal high-end tremolos and such. But the groove on this track, on top of those heavy chugs, was pretty cool. And then you get this, like, soft, clean melody where everything drops out and then it goes into clean sections before it shifts out of nowhere into tremolo and blasts galore. And then Body Behavior, this, for the most part, felt more like post-hardcore black metal. Like, you get those atonal post-hardcore riffs. It's very punky in the rhythms. And yeah, you do get blast beats and tremolos, but they're used very sparingly on the track. Now, Winona starts off as a continuation from where Incidental Part 3 left off. And it does build up with this isolated hi-hat and snare drum passage before it just soars into tremolo melodies once again, excuse me, hiccups. And then, of course, your black metal blasts. But I will say the song itself feels a little too upbeat for its own good. And then The Marvelous Orange Tree, like, this was probably the slowest song on the album. Like, it's almost doom metal oriented, almost like Agalloch to a lesser extent, but with like a static tremolo melody on top of the doomy rhythms. Even bass melody, which I appreciate a good bass melody as well. But again, it's one of those very bright songs on the album. Now, production-wise, it has its quirks. It's pretty raw. However, I would say my biggest complaint about the production was in the faster sections, the kick drums were buried in the mix. But whenever you get them in slower sections, you can hear them, but barely. To use a quote from Jammin' John when describing the kick drum sound on Dark Thrones Under a Funeral Moon, literally the kick drum sound on this album sounds like you're throwing a golf ball at a pillow. That's really what it is, because the kick drums are buried and garbage in the mix. But the guitar tone, I don't mind. The bass tone's pretty cool. And now the other issues. Now, okay, I have quite a few issues with this album. First off, I feel a lot of some of like the really melodic sections I think would have benefited more by having clean vocals rather than the big black metal screeching vocals. Like, especially on tracks like The Garden Route. There should have been some clean vocals on that song, and I think it would have helped make it stronger. And then, of course, some of the other issues that I had would be like some of these post-hardcore elements coming in, which I understand that's been a part of their sound ever since they started. But again, post-hardcore isn't always my thing. And I would argue this album really drags. This album is over an hour long, and I feel a lot of these songs could have had the fat trimmed off of them. And I think you could have maybe made this down to about a 47-minute album, and I think it would have made the album much stronger. But overall, I'm not saying like the songs themselves are bad. It's mostly moments within the songs that I really, really like the melodic sections, the more aggressive parts, especially in Revelator. But aside from that, the songs aren't bad. It's mostly moments within the songs I like, but there were other moments where it's like either whittle things down or change things up in terms of the vocals. So overall, I'm going to give this a 3 out of 5. It's a decent album, all things considered, even though I'm not the world's biggest blackgaze, post-black metal fan. But I can see why this band is really popular, and then also that album cover. I'll comment on it real quick. The model on the cover, that's porn actress Jenna Hayes. And yeah, she's a total babe and a metalhead, so I give her credit for that. But yeah, the album cover's kind of weird for an album like this. I just wanted to make that point, but I digress. But yeah, if you are a fan of Deafheaven, chances are you're already got this album. But for me, it's decent, but I don't know if I'm going to return to it just because blackgaze isn't really for me. But of course, those are just my opinions. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. But until next time, thank you for watching, keep your horns high, and your dreams wet.